The courtroom was silent, except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Naomi Carter sat at the elevated bench, her gaze calm but penetrating as she surveyed the room. The air was thick with tension, a hallmark of her courtroom, where justice was meted out with precision and an unwavering sense of duty. Naomi's reputation preceded her, a black woman who had clawed her way to prominence in a system riddled with inequities. She was known for her stern demeanor and incorruptible ethics. The press often dubbed her the unshakable judge, and she wore the title like armor. Today, however, that armor felt unusually heavy. Case number 57238, the state versus Daniel Whitaker. The clerk announced, and Naomi's heart skipped a beat. The defendant, a tall man with disheveled blonde hair and a weary expression, was led to his seat. Naomi's breath caught. She knew him well. Daniel Whitaker wasn't just any defendant. He was her childhood best friend. The gavel in her hand suddenly felt like a relic from a different life. She could still see it, the dusty streets of their small southern town, divided by more than just railroad tracks. One side bustled with affluent white families, their homes pristine and polished. The other side, where Naomi and her family lived, bore the weight of generations of systemic neglect. But amidst the oppressive atmosphere of the town, Naomi and Daniel had found each other. He was the boy who climbed trees with her, who helped her rescue stray cats, and who listened to her dream of one day becoming a lawyer to fight the injustices they both knew too well. Their friendship had been a rare and fragile bridge across an otherwise uncrossable divide. "Naomi," he would say with that confident grin, "one day, you'll change everything." She hadn't thought about him in years. Life had pulled them apart, as it so often did to childhood dreams. "Mr. Whitaker," Naomi finally said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "You are charged with assault, theft, and resisting arrest. How do you plead?" Daniel raised his head, his blue eyes locking with hers for the briefest moment. "Not guilty, Your Honor. Not guilty." The words reverberated through her, stirring up a conflict she had never prepared for. Her job was to remain impartial. But how could she when the man before her was a part of her own story? The prosecution, led by the seasoned and unrelenting Malcolm Hayes, stood and delivered his opening statement. The evidence, he claimed, would show Daniel's guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. A security camera captured him fleeing the scene of a robbery, and police reports described a violent confrontation during his arrest. Naomi kept her expression neutral, but a knot of doubt began to form. Something about the narrative felt off. Karen Fields, Daniel's defense attorney, rose next, a sharp and fearless advocate. Karen was known for her ability to dismantle even the most airtight cases. "The prosecution will tell you a story," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "But stories are not facts. And in this case, the facts simply don't add up." As the trial unfolded, Naomi fought to compartmentalize her emotions. Her mind wandered to the little boy she used to know. Had life been as unkind to Daniel as it had been to so many in their town? Or was she just romanticizing the past? Her reverie was interrupted by Karen's cross-examination of the first witness, a police officer involved in Daniel's arrest. The officer's testimony was confident but rehearsed, and Karen pounced on the inconsistencies like a predator sensing weakness. "Officer Davis," Karen said, her tone sharp, "you stated that my client resisted arrest violently. Yet your report makes no mention of injuries sustained by you or your partner. Can you explain why?" The officer hesitated. It wasn't significant enough to report." Karen smiled, a shark sensing blood. "So, your account of resistance is based solely on your subjective interpretation. Not any verifiable evidence?" The courtroom murmured as Naomi called for order. She could see the seeds of doubt planting themselves in the jury's minds. Still, the case was far from over. Later that evening, Naomi sat alone in her chambers. The image of Daniel as a boy, laughing, carefree, kept intruding on her thoughts. Was this the same man now accused of such heinous acts? Could she trust herself to separate the past from the present? Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mentor. "Justice Evelyn Marks, stay strong. Justice is blind, but it must also be brave." Naomi sighed. Blindness was easy. Bravery, she feared, would cost far more. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom. casting a golden hue over the rows of seats filled with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. The trial of Daniel Whitaker had quickly become a spectacle, drawing attention for its sensational elements. A white defendant accused of a violent crime, a black judge known for her integrity, and whispers of potential corruption in the police department. Naomi Carter entered the room, her face a mask of professionalism. Inside, however, her thoughts swirled. She had barely slept, her dreams haunted by the echoes of childhood laughter and the grim reality of the present. Prosecutor Malcolm Hayes was in his element, a man of imposing stature and sharp intellect. He thrived on the theater of the courtroom. Today, he strode confidently to the podium, ready to lay out his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his deep voice resonating through the room. "The evidence in this case is clear. Daniel Whitaker committed an act of violence that endangered innocent lives. He stole, he resisted arrest, and he showed blatant disregard for the law." Naomi's gaze remained steady, but her mind dissected every word. Hayes continued, presenting the prosecution's evidence. 1. Surveillance footage. A video purportedly showing Daniel fleeing the scene of a robbery at a convenience store. 2. Witness testimony. Statements from bystanders placing Daniel at the scene. 3. Police report. Detailed accounts of Daniel resisting arrest and allegedly attacking an officer. The jury nodded in somber understanding. Hayes had built his case meticulously, painting Daniel as a reckless criminal. Karen Field stood next. Her demeanor was calm but forceful, her every word carrying weight. She approached the jury with deliberate steps, her presence commanding their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, "the prosecution's story might seem compelling at first glance, but I urge you to look deeper. What they are presenting isn't evidence, it's conjecture, shaped to fit a convenient narrative." Her first target was the surveillance footage. Karen played the video on a monitor for the jury. The grainy footage showed a figure running out of the store, but the angle was poor, and the individual's face was obscured. Karen pointed to the screen. "Can anyone here definitively say this is my client?" The answer is no. Yet, the prosecution would have you believe this blurry figure is Daniel Whitaker. She moved on to the witness testimony, highlighting inconsistencies between statements. One witness claims the suspect wore a red hoodie. Another says it was blue. Yet another describes no hoodie at all. How can we trust such unreliable accounts? Finally, Karen turned to the police report. And then there's the matter of the arrest. Officer Davis claims Mr. Whitaker resisted violently. Yet, no injuries were documented, no video evidence exists, and no independent witnesses corroborate this claim. Why? From her position on the bench, Naomi observed the courtroom's shifting dynamics. Malcolm Hayes was visibly frustrated, his carefully constructed narrative under attack. Karen Fields, on the other hand, was relentless, picking apart every piece of evidence with precision. Naomi's own doubts deepened. The surveillance footage was indeed inconclusive, and the police report lacked critical details. She knew she had to maintain neutrality, but her instincts, honed by years of experience, told her that something was amiss. During a recess, Naomi's mind wandered back to Daniel. She couldn't stop the flood of memories, his mischievous grin, the way he would offer to share his lunch when she had none, the fierce determination in his eyes when he talked about escaping their town. She thought of how their paths had diverged. She had fought her way into law school, while Daniel's life had taken a different trajectory. The rumors about him, trouble with the law, struggles with employment, had reached her years ago, but she had dismissed them as gossip. Now, those rumors felt too close to the truth. That evening, Karen Fields sat in her office, poring over documents. She knew the case was a battle uphill. The system was stacked against defendants like Daniel, white men without resources, caught in the crosshairs of a system eager to make an example of someone. Her assistant, Jordan, entered with new information. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing her a folder. Inside were records showing that Officer Davis, the arresting officer, had been investigated multiple times for misconduct, including allegations of excessive force and falsifying reports. The complaints had been quietly dismissed, but Karen knew this was the crack in the case she needed. "Dig deeper," Karen instructed. "Find me anything else on Davis. If he's lied before, he's probably lying now." That night, Naomi sat in her modest apartment, staring out the window at the city lights. Her mind replayed the day's events, Karen's sharp arguments, the jury's shifting expressions, and Daniel's weary face. She thought of her younger self, the idealistic girl who had dreamed of justice. Was this justice? Presiding over a case that seemed increasingly flawed? Naomi reached for her journal, a habit she had maintained for years. She wrote a single line before closing it and going to bed: "Justice must be blind. But it cannot be indifferent." The courtroom was abuzz with whispers as the trial resumed the next morning. The spectators, reporters, and even the jury seemed more invested now. The defense's aggressive challenges to the prosecution's evidence had planted a seed of doubt. And everyone was eager to see what would unfold next. Judge Naomi Carter entered with her usual calm composure. Though inside, she braced herself. The stakes felt heavier with each passing hour. And the case's flaws gnawed at her. Her role as an impartial arbiter had never felt more challenging. Karen Fields was in her element as she called her next witness, Miguel Ortiz, an employee at the convenience store where the robbery took place. Miguel, a middle-aged man with a nervous demeanor, took the stand, glancing at the crowd as though the weight of the room might crush him. "Mr. Ortiz," Karen began, her tone gentle but firm, "you were working at the store on the night in question. Can you confirm that?" Miguel nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I was the cashier." Karen walked toward the jury, her expression thoughtful. "And can you describe what you saw that night?" Miguel hesitated, his hands fidgeting. "Well, I saw someone come in, wearing a hoodie. They grabbed a few things and ran out." Karen nodded. "Did you see their face?" "No," Miguel admitted. "They had the hood up. And it was dark. I couldn't tell who it was." The courtroom murmured. Karen's point was clear. The eyewitness testimony couldn't definitively identify Daniel. "Thank you, Mr. Ortiz," Karen said, her voice calm but triumphant. She turned to the jury. "Remember, ladies and gentlemen, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. If Mr. Ortiz, who was present during the incident, cannot identify the defendant, how can we be sure of his guilt?" Karen's next move was bold. She brought in a technology expert, a young woman named Tasha Reynolds, who had analyzed the surveillance footage. Tasha projected the grainy video onto a screen for the courtroom to see. "Ms. Reynolds," Karen began, "you were hired to examine this footage. What did you find?" Tasha adjusted her glasses. "I found significant gaps in the video's timestamps. There are missing frames, which suggest either a technical malfunction or intentional editing." The courtroom erupted into whispers, and Naomi quickly banged her gavel. "Order in the court," she demanded, though her own mind was racing. Karen pressed on. "So, to clarify, this video cannot be considered reliable evidence?" "That's correct," Tasha confirmed. "It's impossible to verify its authenticity in its current state." Karen turned to the jury, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. The prosecution's most damning piece of evidence was now riddled with doubt. From her bench, Naomi observed the jury's reactions. Confusion, doubt, and even frustration were written across their faces. She could feel the tide turning, but it didn't bring her comfort. If the prosecution's case was this flawed, why had it been pursued so aggressively? Was there something deeper at play? During a brief recess, Naomi retreated to her chambers. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing not the stoic judge but a woman grappling with her own past and the weight of the present. A knock at the door startled her. It was her clerk. "Sarah, Your Honor, I thought you'd want to see this," Sarah said, handing Naomi a file. Naomi flipped through it, her brows furrowing. It was a report detailing prior complaints against Officer Davis, the arresting officer. The allegations of excessive force and falsified evidence were chilling. Naomi's hand tightened on the file. The justice system was supposed to be a sanctuary of fairness, but this case was exposing cracks in its foundation. Malcolm Hayes was visibly rattled when court resumed, but he wasn't about to let Karen Fields dismantle his case without a fight. He called Officer Davis to the stand, determined to salvage the prosecution's credibility. "Officer Davis," Hayes began, "can you recount the events leading to Mr. Whitaker's arrest?" Davis sat tall, his uniform pristine and his tone authoritative. "We received a call about a robbery and spotted a man matching the description running away. When we approached, he became aggressive, and we had to subdue him." Hayes nodded approvingly. "And you're certain the man you arrested was Daniel Whitaker?" "Yes, sir," Davis replied confidently. There's no doubt in my mind. Karen rose for cross-examination, her expression a mixture of skepticism and resolve. Officer Davis, she began, you mentioned that Mr. Whitaker became aggressive. Can you explain why no injuries, neither yours nor your partner's, were documented? Davis shifted in his seat. The altercation was brief. It didn't result in significant injuries. Karen pressed on. And yet, your report describes Mr. Whitaker as violent and combative. Isn't that inconsistent? Davis faltered. I wouldn't say that. Karen's eyes narrowed. You've been investigated for misconduct before, haven't you, Officer Davis? Hayes objected, but Naomi overruled him. The witness will answer the question. Davis's confidence cracked. Yes, he admitted reluctantly, but those complaints were baseless. Karen stepped closer. Perhaps they suggest a pattern of behavior that casts doubt on your testimony. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Karen returned to her seat, leaving Davis visibly shaken. That night, Naomi sat in her apartment once again. The file on Officer Davis opened before her. The allegations against him were damning, and yet they had been swept under the rug. It wasn't the first time she had encountered systemic failures in her career. But this case felt personal. She thought of Daniel, of how easily he could have been another casualty of the system if not for Karen's tenacity. She thought of her own responsibility, not just to this case but to the broader fight for justice. Her journal lay open on the desk, and she wrote, "Justice isn't just about the law, it's about the truth." The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker as the trial entered its third week. The stakes were rising with every piece of evidence and every witness testimony. Spectators filled the gallery, their faces a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. Reporters whispered furiously into their recorders, and the jury exchanged glances that revealed the weight of the decision they'd eventually have to make. Judge Naomi Carter took her seat, her face as unreadable as ever, though the turmoil inside her continued to churn. The case had gone from straightforward to murky, with questions of corruption and systemic bias hanging over every word spoken in her courtroom. The prosecution called its next witness, Detective Marcus Slade, the lead investigator on the case. Slade was a veteran officer with a reputation for results, though rumors of his heavy-handed methods had followed him for years. He entered the courtroom with a quiet confidence, his sharp suit and polished demeanor designed to exude authority. Prosecutor Malcolm Hayes wasted no time. Detective Slade, can you walk us through your role in the investigation? Slade leaned into the microphone, his voice measured and steady. I was the lead detective assigned to the case. My team reviewed the surveillance footage, gathered witness statements, and coordinated with the arresting officers to build the case. Hayes nodded approvingly. And you're confident in the evidence presented? Absolutely, Slade replied. The surveillance footage and Officer Davis's testimony leave no room for doubt. Karen Fields rose for cross-examination, her expression sharper than ever. Detective Slade, you've worked on numerous high-profile cases. Have you ever had any of your investigations questioned for ethical reasons? Slade's jaw tightened. No, I conduct all my investigations by the book. Karen smiled, a predator sensing weakness. Interesting, because I've uncovered several complaints against you. Complaints alleging coercion of witnesses and mishandling of evidence. Do you deny these allegations? Hayes objected, but Naomi overruled him. The witness will answer. Slade's confidence faltered for the first time. Those complaints were investigated and found to be baseless. Karen's smile widened. So, you admit they exist? Slade's silence spoke volumes. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Karen returned to her seat, leaving the jury to ponder the credibility of the prosecution's star investigator. During a break, Naomi retreated to her chambers, feeling the weight of the case pressing down on her. Her mind replayed the day's events, Slade's evasive answers, the inconsistencies in the evidence, and the lingering sense that the system was failing its promise of impartiality. Her clerk, Sarah, entered hesitantly. Your Honor, I thought you'd want to see this. Sarah handed Naomi a new file containing internal police documents Karen's team had uncovered. The documents revealed that Slade had been involved in several cases where evidence was mishandled. But the issues had been buried to protect his career. Naomi's stomach turned. This wasn't just a case of one man's guilt or innocence. It was a window into the broader corruption that tainted the system she had devoted her life to. Outside the courthouse, tensions were rising. Protesters had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice for Daniel" and "End Police Corruption." Across the street, a smaller group carried signs supporting the police, shouting slogans like "Law and Order for All." The media swarmed both sides, capturing the heated exchanges. Naomi watched from her office window, the scene below a stark reminder of how deeply this case had divided the community. She knew her verdict, whatever it might be, would ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. Malcolm Hayes, feeling the case slipping through his fingers, ramped up his strategy. He brought in a new witness, a bystander who claimed to have seen Daniel near the scene of the crime. The witness, a young woman named Rachel Simmons, seemed nervous but determined. "I saw him," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "He was running down the street, holding a bag." Karen's cross-examination was swift. "Ms. Simmons, can you confirm what was in the bag?" "No," Rachel admitted. "It was dark, and I didn't get a clear look." Karen pressed further. "And can you confirm the man you saw was the defendant, Daniel Whitaker?" Rachel hesitated. I think it was him." Karen stepped closer, her voice soft but unyielding. "You think? Or you know?" Rachel looked down, her uncertainty clear. "I'm not sure." The jury exchanged glances, and Naomi could feel the momentum shifting once again. That evening, Karen Fields and her assistant, Jordan, worked late into the night. They had received an anonymous tip about another potential eyewitness, someone who had been reluctant to come forward but claimed to have seen the entire incident. Jordan leaned over Karen's desk. "The tipster says the eyewitness works at a nearby diner. I can follow up in the morning." Karen nodded, her mind racing. This could be the break they needed, a first-hand account that might exonerate Daniel or at least introduce reasonable doubt. Naomi sat alone in her chambers long after the courthouse had emptied. The file on Detective Slade lay open before her, alongside her own handwritten notes. Her journal was nearby, its pages filled with reflections on the case. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Justice must be fair. But fairness demands courage." Naomi thought of Daniel, not just the man on trial, but the boy she had grown up with, the boy who had believed in her even when she doubted herself. She knew she couldn't let personal feelings cloud her judgment, but she also couldn't ignore the systemic failures that had brought them to this moment. As she closed her journal, Naomi resolved to see the truth through, no matter where it led. The courtroom felt like a battlefield as the trial reached its midpoint. Each day, the stakes climbed higher, the tension more palpable. Both the prosecution and the defense were determined, their strategies growing more aggressive as the jury watched with rapt attention. The once clear lines between guilt and innocence were now blurred by conflicting narratives and mounting revelations. Judge Naomi Carter maintained her composure, her gavel frequently calling the room to order. But inside, her thoughts churned. The weight of the case, and its broader implications, pressed down on her with unrelenting force. Karen Fields stood before the jury, her expression calm but purposeful. It was time to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. Her next move was critical. "I call to the stand Miguel Ortiz," Karen announced. The man returned to the witness chair, his previous testimony about the robbery still fresh in the jury's minds. Karen approached him with a measured step, her voice soft but unyielding. "Mr. Ortiz, in your previous testimony, you stated that the person you saw in the store was wearing a hoodie and fled quickly. Is that correct?" "Yes," Miguel replied. Karen held up a printed frame from the surveillance video. "Is this the footage you believe shows the suspect?" Miguel nodded hesitantly. "I think so." Karen stepped closer, her tone sharpening. "Mr. Ortiz, can you say with absolute certainty that this is the defendant, Daniel Whitaker?" Miguel's shoulders slumped. "No, I didn't see his face." The prosecution objected, but Karen pressed on. "Mr. Ortiz, do you recall hearing any specific sounds or details that night? Anything that could help identify the individual?" Miguel hesitated, then shook his head. "No, ma'am, it all happened so fast." Karen faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now have two major issues: the grainy surveillance footage and a witness who cannot identify my client. If the prosecution cannot prove that Daniel Whitaker was even present at the scene, how can they claim he committed the crime?" The prosecution was not without its weapons. Malcolm Hayes called his own witness, a forensic analyst who had examined the stolen items recovered from the robbery scene. The analyst testified that Daniel's fingerprints had been found on a soda bottle left behind. Can you confirm these fingerprints belong to the defendant? Hayes asked. Yes, the analyst replied confidently. The fingerprints are a match. The courtroom murmured. Karen Fields frowned, scribbling notes. Hayes turned to the jury, his voice ringing with certainty. This is physical evidence, he declared. Proof that Daniel Whitaker was present at the scene of the crime. Karen rose for cross-examination, her expression unreadable. You've testified that these fingerprints match my client. Can you confirm when those prints were left on the bottle? The analyst blinked, caught off guard. No, we can't determine the exact time. Karen stepped closer. So, it's possible those fingerprints were left before the night of the alleged robbery? Yes, the analyst admitted. Karen's voice grew stronger. And is it also possible that Mr. Whitaker simply purchased a soda from the store earlier that day or week, leaving his fingerprints behind? The analyst hesitated. Yes, it's possible. Karen turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we see evidence that raises more questions than answers. The defense's investigation bore fruit when Karen introduced a surprise witness, Angela Miller, a waitress at a diner near the crime scene. Angela was hesitant but determined as she took the stand. Ms. Miller, Karen began, can you tell the court what you saw on the night of the robbery? Angela glanced nervously at the jury. I was closing up the diner when I saw a man running down the street. He didn't look like the man sitting there, she said, nodding toward Daniel. The courtroom buzzed with excitement, and Naomi banged her gavel to restore order. Karen pressed on. Can you describe this man? Angela nodded. He was shorter, stockier, and had darker hair. He wore a hoodie, but it wasn't red like they said, it was black. Malcolm Hayes objected, but the damage was done. Angela's testimony had introduced a new suspect, planting a seed of doubt that the jury couldn't ignore. Naomi's impartiality was tested yet again. Angela's testimony, combined with the flaws in the prosecution's evidence, made her question the fairness of the charges against Daniel. She saw the faces of the jurors, their expressions shifting from confidence to doubt. That evening, Naomi returned to her chambers, her thoughts a storm. She opened the file on Detective Marcus Slade, the police officer whose methods had come under scrutiny. Each piece of evidence suggested a pattern of manipulation, a chilling reminder of the system's flaws. Naomi wrote in her journal, "Justice demands clarity. But what happens when clarity is deliberately obscured?" The next day, Karen Fields called Detective Slade back to the stand. Her questions were pointed, her tone relentless. Detective Slade, you've testified that the evidence in this case was collected fairly and accurately. Is that correct? Yes, Slade replied, his voice clipped. Karen held up the internal report Naomi had seen earlier. Can you explain why multiple complaints against you allege evidence tampering and coercion of witnesses? Slade's face hardened. Those complaints were baseless. Karen leaned forward, her voice cutting. Baseless, or buried, because my team has evidence suggesting otherwise. The courtroom gasped, and Slade's composure cracked. Karen drove the point home. If you have a history of misconduct, how can the jury trust your investigation in this case? Naomi intervened to restore order. But the damage was done. The jury looked shaken, and Slade's credibility was in tatters. As the day ended, the jury's faces revealed a storm of emotions. Uncertainty, doubt, and frustration. Karen's relentless questioning and the emergence of Angela Miller's testimony had shifted the narrative. Naomi watched them file out, their expressions heavy. The truth was slipping through the cracks of the system. But she knew the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with an air of expectation as the trial neared its critical midpoint. Both the prosecution and the defense were pulling out all the stops. With every witness, every piece of evidence, every objection contributing to the mounting tension. Outside, the protests had grown larger, louder, and more polarized. Inside, the jury sat with the weight of an impossible decision pressing on their shoulders. Judge Naomi Carter took her place on the bench. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, searching for clues in her expression. But she gave them nothing. This case was turning into a labyrinth of deception and systemic flaws. And she was determined to navigate it with integrity, even as it tore at her resolve. Malcolm Hayes rose, his expression grim but determined. The prosecution was on the ropes, and he knew it. The doubts raised by the defense had shaken his case to the core. But he had one final card to play. "I call Officer Davis to the stand," Hayes announced. Officer Davis, whose testimony had already been scrutinized, returned with a stoic demeanor. Hayes approached him with measured steps, his tone firm but calm. Officer Davis, can you tell the court about the bag recovered from the crime scene? Hayes asked. Yes, Davis replied. We recovered a black duffel bag containing cash and other items stolen from the store. The bag was found near where we apprehended the defendant. Hayes nodded. And did the defendant admit ownership of the bag? No, but it was found in his vicinity. Davis said confidently. Karen Fields stood for a cross-examination, her expression steely. Officer Davis, you mentioned that the bag was found near the defendant. How far away, exactly? Davis hesitated. Approximately 15 feet. Karen raised an eyebrow. 15 feet? In a public area where anyone could have dropped it? Yes, but, Karen cut him off. And was there any forensic evidence linking my client to the bag? Davis fumbled. No, but the circumstances. Karen's voice grew sharper. Circumstances are not evidence. Officer Davis, without forensic proof, how can you definitively tie my client to this bag? The courtroom murmured, and Naomi's gavel restored order. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was crumbling under Karen's relentless questioning. During a recess, Naomi returned to her chambers, where a file from her clerk awaited her. It was an anonymous tip, containing internal memos suggesting that the bag found at the scene had been planted as evidence. The memos referenced Detective Marcus Slade, whose credibility had already been called into question. Naomi stared at the papers, her stomach churning. This wasn't just a flawed case, it was a deliberate attempt to manipulate the truth. She knew she couldn't ignore this revelation, but introducing it into the trial would bring enormous consequences. Karen Fields' investigation had uncovered another critical piece of evidence, an eyewitness who could potentially exonerate Daniel. She called Miguel Ortiz back to the stand. Mr. Ortiz, Karen began, you testified that you couldn't clearly see the suspect's face. Is that correct? Yes, Miguel replied cautiously. Karen nodded. But during the robbery, did you hear anything unusual? Miguel hesitated. I heard someone yell something. It was a name, I think. Karen leaned forward. What name? Miguel looked nervous but answered. They yelled, Slade. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Naomi's gavel thundered. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Karen turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the name Miguel Ortiz heard was Slade, the same name as Detective Marcus Slade, whose involvement in this case has already been called into question. Detective Slade was recalled to the stand, his demeanor visibly shaken. Karen Fields didn't waste a moment. Detective Slade, she began, her voice razor sharp. Can you explain why your name was mentioned during the robbery? Slade stammered. I have no idea. That doesn't make any sense. Karen pressed on. Isn't it true that you were under investigation for misconduct in previous cases? Cases involving planted evidence and coerced testimony? Slade's composure cracked. Those allegations were never proven. Karen took a step closer, her voice rising. Yet here we are again, with evidence that suggests you may have manipulated this case as well. Isn't it true that you planted the duffel bag to frame my client? Slade's face turned pale. I would never. Karen's voice thundered. Isn't it true, Detective Slade, that you were willing to do whatever it took to secure a conviction? Even if it meant sacrificing an innocent man? The courtroom was electric with tension. Slade's silence was deafening, and the jury's eyes burned with disbelief. As the courtroom adjourned for the day, Naomi sat alone in her chambers, the weight of the case pressing down on her like never before. The revelations about Slade, the anonymous tip, and the growing evidence of corruption had turned this trial into a crucible of justice. She opened her journal, her hand trembling as she wrote, "The system is only as strong as its weakest link." And right now, that link is breaking. Naomi knew she had to act, but the cost of doing so felt immeasurable. Her decision in the coming days would not only determine Daniel's fate but also expose the depths of corruption within the system she had sworn to uphold. The trial had reached a fever pitch. Each revelation, each cross-examination, and each whispered accusation had turned the courtroom into a pressure cooker of tension and intrigue. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with reporters jostling for position and protesters chanting outside. Judge Naomi Carter entered the room with her usual air of authority. Though inside, the weight of the case threatened to break her resolve. She scanned the courtroom. Daniel Whitaker sat at the defendant's table, looking weary but resolute. His defense attorney, Karen Fields, was a pillar of determination, her sharp gaze fixed on the prosecution table where Malcolm Hayes sat, his jaw tight. Detective Marcus Slade was conspicuously absent, his reputation in tatters after the previous day's revelations. Naomi banged her gavel. The court is now in session. Karen Fields wasted no time. She had uncovered another piece of evidence, one that could turn the case on its head. Your Honor, she began. The defense calls Detective Marcus Slade to the stand. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Naomi's gavel struck again, her voice firm. Order in the court. Slade entered reluctantly, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of itself. The whispers in the gallery grew louder as he took the oath. Karen's tone was icier than ever. Detective Slade, you previously testified that all evidence in this case was collected fairly and accurately. Is that correct? Yes, Slade replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen approached him with a folder in hand. Detective, are you familiar with this document? She handed it to him, and Slade's face blanched. It was a memo from an internal police investigation, detailing instances where he had tampered with evidence in previous cases. Naomi had seen the memo in her chambers, but now it was being presented in open court. Karen pressed on. Detective Slade, this document outlines multiple instances of misconduct under your leadership. It specifically mentions evidence tampering. Would you care to explain? Slade shifted uncomfortably. Those allegations were never proven. Karen's voice sharpened. But they exist. And isn't it true that in this case, you were the officer who discovered the duffel bag allegedly linked to my client? Slade hesitated. Yes, but, Karen interrupted. And isn't it also true that this bag was not listed in the initial police inventory report? The courtroom erupted. Naomi's gavel struck repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this court. Karen turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have proof of a history of misconduct by Detective Slade and evidence that this case may have been manipulated from the start. Malcolm Hayes rose, his frustration visible. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a baseless attack on a decorated officer. Karen shot back, her voice icy. Baseless? The prosecution's entire case hinges on evidence provided by Detective Slade, a man with a proven record of tampering and deceit. Naomi intervened, her voice firm. Ms. Fields, Mr. Hayes, this court will not devolve into theatrics. Proceed. Hayes called his next witness, Rachel Simmons, the bystander who claimed to have seen Daniel fleeing the scene. Rachel's testimony had already been shaky, but Hayes needed her to bolster the prosecution's crumbling narrative. Ms. Simmons, Hayes began, can you confirm that you saw the defendant near the scene of the crime? Rachel glanced nervously at the jury. I think so. Karen rose for cross-examination, her tone sympathetic but probing. Ms. Simmons, you've stated that it was dark and that you didn't get a clear look at the suspect's face. Is that correct? Yes, Rachel admitted. Karen stepped closer. So, when you say you think it was the defendant, what you really mean is that you're not sure. Isn't that right? Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Karen turned to the jury, her voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we see the prosecution's evidence is built on uncertainty and speculation, not facts. As the trial dragged on, Naomi felt the tension in the room reach a boiling point. Every revelation, every contradiction, and every moment of doubt chipped away at the system she had spent her life upholding. She knew the trial had become more than just a question of Daniel's guilt or innocence. It was a battle for the integrity of the justice system itself. That evening, Naomi sat alone in her chambers. The anonymous tip file opened before her. She reread the memos implicating Slade and the other officers involved in the case. Her hands trembled as she considered her options. She could introduce the documents as evidence, but doing so would bring the entire justice system into question. She wrote in her journal, "What is justice if it ignores the truth? And what is the truth worth if it destroys the system meant to protect it?" The next day, Karen Fields presented her final piece of evidence, a video recording from a nearby diner's security camera. The footage, which her team had obtained late the previous night, showed a man fleeing the scene of the robbery. He wore a black hoodie and had a stockier build than Daniel Whitaker. This, ladies and gentlemen, Karen said, her voice steady, is the man who matches the description given by multiple witnesses. And it is not Daniel Whitaker. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Naomi's gavel struck repeatedly, her voice rising. Order. I demand order in this court. Karen turned to the jury. The defense rests, confident that the prosecution has failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. As the trial recessed for jury deliberations, Naomi returned to her chambers, her mind racing. The evidence, the testimonies, and the revelations had painted a damning picture, not of Daniel Whitaker, but of the system itself. She knew the jury's verdict would decide more than just one man's fate. It would expose the flaws that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. Naomi sat at her desk, staring at her gavel. For the first time in her career, she felt the weight of its symbolic power. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their expressions unreadable. The entire gallery held its breath, waiting for the decision that would determine not just Daniel Whitaker's fate, but also the credibility of the justice system itself. Outside, the din of protesters and media was muffled, their chants a distant echo of the tension inside. Judge Naomi Carter took her place at the bench, her heart pounding. The evidence presented during the trial had revealed cracks in the foundation of the system she had dedicated her life to. And this verdict would be the culmination of everything the trial had exposed. Has the jury reached a verdict? Naomi asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. The clerk took the slip of paper from the foreperson and handed it to Naomi. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. Her face remained impassive, a practiced mask of neutrality, as she handed it back to the clerk to be read aloud. In the case of the state versus Daniel Whitaker, we the jury find the defendant. The pause stretched unbearably. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Cheers from Daniel's supporters mingled with gasps of disbelief from others. The gavel thundered repeatedly as Naomi called for order. Silence in the court, she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. At the defense table, Daniel slumped in his seat, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. Karen Fields placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, her expression triumphant but tempered. She had fought tooth and nail for this moment, but the victory was bittersweet, knowing it came at the cost of exposing deep flaws in the system. Daniel turned to Karen, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for believing in me. Karen nodded. This was never just about you, Daniel. It was about the truth. The courtroom gallery was a chaotic mix of emotions. Daniel's family and supporters embraced one another, tears streaming down their faces. Meanwhile, the prosecution team sat stone-faced, their defeat evident. Malcolm Hayes avoided eye contact with anyone, his earlier confidence shattered. Naomi watched the scene unfold, her gavel still in her hand. She felt the weight of the trial's implications pressing down on her. This was a victory for one man, but it was a stark reminder of how many others might not have had the same chance. After the courtroom emptied, Daniel approached Naomi cautiously. She was still seated at the bench, her robes a symbol of the authority she had wielded throughout the trial. Your Honor, he began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to say thank you for being fair, for seeing the truth. Naomi looked at him, her stern expression softening. Daniel, my role is to uphold justice, not to pass judgment beyond the evidence. But this case wasn't just about you. It revealed things about our system that I can't ignore. He nodded, his eyes filled with emotion. It wasn't just me on trial, was it? No, Naomi said quietly. It never is. In the days following the verdict, the fallout from the trial rippled through the legal and law enforcement communities. Detective Marcus Slade was suspended pending a formal investigation. Karen Fields' team submitted evidence of his misconduct to the district attorney's office, sparking a public outcry for accountability. Slade's actions became a symbol of the systemic failures within the justice system. Protesters demanded reforms, and the media hounded him relentlessly. His name, once synonymous with results, was now a cautionary tale. At home, Naomi sat at her desk, staring at her journal. The trial was over, but its impact lingered. She wrote, "Justice isn't perfect. It's a fragile thing, dependent on the integrity of those who wield it. This case reminded me how easily it can be broken, and how much work it takes to repair." Naomi resolved to use her position to advocate for change. She reached out to colleagues, community leaders, and legal reform advocates, determined to address the systemic issues the trial had exposed. For Karen Fields, the trial was a turning point. She had always been a fierce advocate for her clients, but this case had shown her just how pervasive corruption could be. She began working with civil rights organizations, pushing for greater transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Karen's victory in Daniel's case was celebrated, but she made it clear in interviews and public appearances that it wasn't just about one man. For every Daniel Whitaker who gets justice, she said, there are countless others who don't. That has to change. For Daniel, freedom was bittersweet. He had spent years struggling under the weight of a system that had nearly destroyed him. Now, he was determined to make the most of his second chance. He started working with a community outreach program, helping at-risk youth avoid the pitfalls he had faced. One day, he visited Naomi in her chambers. I want to thank you again, he said, and I want to help make things better. However I can. Naomi smiled, a rare gesture. Then start with your story. Daniel, let people know what happened to you. Change starts with the truth. The trial of Daniel Whitaker became a catalyst for change. Investigations into law enforcement practices were launched, leading to new policies aimed at preventing misconduct. Judges, attorneys, and activists joined forces to push for reforms that would make the system more just and equitable. Naomi, Karen, and Daniel each played their part, their paths intersecting as they worked toward a common goal, ensuring that justice was no longer just an ideal but a reality for everyone. Months later, Naomi stood at a podium, addressing a room filled with legal professionals and community leaders. Behind her, a banner read "Justice for All," a call to action. This trial reminded us of the fragility of justice, she said, but it also reminded us of its power, when we have the courage to confront the truth and demand better. Together, we can build a system that doesn't just punish, but heals, that doesn't just enforce, but protects. The room erupted into applause, and Naomi stepped back, her heart full. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt hope. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of reflection, reconciliation, and action. The verdict had sent shockwaves through the community, sparking conversations about justice, equality, and the deep flaws within the system. For Naomi, Karen, and Daniel, the aftermath was as critical as the trial itself. Naomi sat in her chambers, poring over the countless letters and emails she had received since the trial. Some praised her for her integrity, while others accused her of bias. It was a stark reminder of the polarizing nature of her role. She wrote in her journal, "The law is impartial, but people are not. The law is clear, but life is complicated. How do we balance the two?" Later that evening, she met with her mentor, Justice Evelyn Marks, at a quiet cafe. "You've done something remarkable," Evelyn said, sipping her tea. Naomi shook her head. "The trial exposed so much that's wrong. I can't help but feel like I'm complicit in a system that allows this to happen." Evelyn leaned forward. "Exposing the flaws is the first step to fixing them. But change doesn't happen overnight, Naomi. It happens case by case, decision by decision, and you've just taken a giant step forward." Karen Fields was inundated with calls from media outlets, advocacy groups, and potential clients. Despite the chaos, she remained focused on the bigger picture. One day, Daniel walked into her office, a folder clutched in his hands. "I want to do something," he said, placing the folder on her desk. "This is my story. I want to use it to help others." Karen opened the folder, finding pages of handwritten notes detailing Daniel's experiences with the justice system. She looked up at him, a smile spreading across her face. "This is powerful, Daniel. We can turn this into something that inspires real change." Together, they began drafting an op-ed for a major publication, detailing not just Daniel's case but the systemic issues it highlighted. The article, titled "The Price of Presumed Guilt: My Fight for Justice," quickly went viral, sparking nationwide discussions about police misconduct and judicial reform. The investigation into Detective Marcus Slade gained momentum. Multiple former defendants came forward, sharing stories of coercion and planted evidence. The district attorney's office announced that they would reopen several cases connected to Slade, many of which resulted in wrongful convictions. Slade himself became a pariah, his once celebrated career in ruins. Facing mounting pressure, He resigned from the force and issued a statement denying all wrongdoing. The community, however, was not convinced. Protests demanding accountability continued to grow. Karen Fields played a key role in these developments, working with civil rights organizations to ensure that the affected individuals received legal representation and support. One afternoon, Daniel visited Naomi in her chambers. The formalities of the courtroom were gone, replaced by the familiarity of two people who had once shared a bond. "You've changed, but not as much as I thought," Daniel said, smiling as he sat across from her. Naomi chuckled softly. "And you've grown up. The last time I saw you, we were kids playing in the dirt." Daniel's face turned serious. "I wish we hadn't lost touch. Maybe things would have been different." Naomi nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but life pulled us in different directions. What matters is what we do now." They spoke for hours, reminiscing about their childhood and discussing their shared vision for justice. Before leaving, Daniel handed Naomi a small, framed photo of the two of them as children. "To remind you where it all started." Naomi placed the photo on her desk, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The trial became a catalyst for change within the local community. Advocacy groups organized town hall meetings to address concerns about police practices and judicial oversight. Karen Fields and Daniel Whitaker became prominent voices in these efforts, using their platform to push for reforms. Naomi attended one of these meetings. Sitting quietly in the back, she listened as Karen and Daniel spoke passionately about their experiences and the need for systemic change. When the meeting ended, several attendees approached Naomi, thanking her for her role in the trial. One young woman, a law student, said, "You've inspired me to pursue justice, not just the kind that's written in law books, but the kind that changes lives." Naomi smiled, her resolve strengthened. "This is why I do this," she thought. The trial's impact spread far beyond the local community. National media outlets picked up the story, focusing on the broader implications of the verdict. Politicians, activists, and scholars weighed in, many calling for sweeping reforms to address police misconduct and judicial bias. Naomi received an invitation to speak at a national legal conference. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted the spotlight. But after much thought, she accepted, viewing it as an opportunity to share her perspective and advocate for change. Her speech, titled "The Fragility of Justice: Lessons from the Whitaker Trial," became a rallying cry for reform. She spoke not just about the law but about the humanity behind it, the lives impacted by every decision made in a courtroom. As the months passed, Naomi, Karen, and Daniel each found their own ways to continue the fight for justice. Naomi began mentoring young judges, emphasizing the importance of fairness and empathy. Karen expanded her legal practice, focusing on cases that exposed systemic flaws. And Daniel dedicated himself to community outreach, helping others navigate the justice system. One evening, the three of them met for dinner, a rare moment of camaraderie amidst their busy lives. They laughed, shared stories, and reflected on how far they had come. "We've got a long way to go," Karen said, raising her glass, "but we've already come so far," Naomi replied, clinking hers against Karen's. Daniel smiled, "And we're just getting started." The sun rose over the city, casting its golden light on the courthouse that had been the epicenter of the trial that changed everything. Inside its stone walls, Judge Naomi Carter sat at her desk, reviewing cases for the day. The photo Daniel had given her, of the two of them as children, stood framed beside her gavel. It was a reminder of where her journey had begun and how far she had come. The trial of Daniel Whitaker had left an indelible mark on her life. It had challenged her values, forced her to confront the imperfections of the justice system, and inspired her to become not just a guardian of the law but a force for change. Months had passed since the trial, but its impact continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Naomi had used her platform to advocate for judicial reform, emphasizing the importance of transparency, accountability, and humanity within the legal system. At a national legal forum, Naomi delivered a powerful speech. Justice is not a static concept. It is a living, breathing ideal that must evolve with society. The Whitaker trial was not just about one man's innocence. It was about confronting the systemic failures that allowed his life to be placed on the line for a crime he did not commit. We, as arbiters of the law, must ensure that the scales of justice are balanced not just in theory, but in practice. Her words resonated deeply, earning her a standing ovation. Her advocacy efforts led to new policies aimed at preventing prosecutorial misconduct and ensuring greater oversight of law enforcement practices. Karen Fields had become a national figure, her tenacity in the Whitaker case earning her recognition as one of the most influential defense attorneys of her time. But Karen didn't rest on her laurels. She expanded her practice to include a division dedicated to wrongful convictions. Hiring a team of passionate lawyers and investigators, Karen's work wasn't limited to the courtroom. She partnered with civil rights organizations to launch a public education campaign called Justice for All, which aimed to inform citizens about their legal rights and the importance of systemic reform. During one of the campaign's town halls, Karen stood alongside Daniel, who had become a powerful voice in the movement. "We are not here to dismantle the system," Karen said, her voice firm. "We are here to rebuild it, better, stronger, and fairer." For Daniel, life after the trial was a mixture of relief and determination. Freed from the shadow of the accusations, he dedicated himself to helping others who found themselves entangled in a system stacked against them. He became a community organizer, creating a program called Second Chance, which provided legal aid, mentorship, and resources to those struggling to rebuild their lives after incarceration or legal troubles. His program quickly became a model for other communities, drawing attention from national organizations. One day, during a local rally, Daniel addressed the crowd. "I was lucky. I had people who believed in me, who fought for me, but there are so many others who aren't as lucky. This system didn't break overnight, and it won't be fixed overnight. But together, we can make it better. We can make it just." His words were met with thunderous applause. The trial had galvanized the local community, prompting long overdue discussions about race, justice, and accountability. Local leaders implemented new initiatives to improve relationships between law enforcement and the community, including mandatory bias training and the establishment of a civilian oversight board. Naomi, Karen, and Daniel often attended these meetings, their presence a reminder of the case that had sparked the change. While progress was slow, it was steady, and the community began to heal. One evening, Naomi sat in her chambers, the courthouse quiet around her. She opened her journal, flipping through the pages filled with her thoughts during the trial. Each entry was a snapshot of her struggle, her doubt, and her determination. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Justice is not perfection. It is the pursuit of truth, fairness, and compassion in an imperfect world. This trial taught me that justice is not something we achieve once and for all. It is something we fight for every single day." Naomi closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace washing over her. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew she wasn't alone in the battle. She had allies, friends, and a renewed sense of purpose. The story of Daniel Whitaker became a symbol of hope and resilience, a testament to the power of truth and the courage it takes to stand up against injustice. Naomi, Karen, and Daniel each carried the lessons of the trial into their lives, inspiring others to join the fight for a better system. As the courthouse clock struck the hour, Naomi stood and placed her gavel on the desk. She walked out into the evening light, the city bustling with life around her. The path ahead was uncertain, but she faced it with unwavering resolve. Justice, after all, was not a destination, it was a journey.